Hey, this is Elizabeth Van Nostren. Today I'm going to talk to two guests about the influence and applications of chaos theory on population biology and ecology.
I'm Steve Munch. I am an evolutionary ecologist, a mathematical ecologist. I work at NOAA Fisheries, and I'm an adjunct in applied math at UC Santa Cruz. I have an abiding interest in applying math to ecological and evolutionary problems. And for the past decade or so, I've been thinking a lot about chaos and nonlinear forecasting and its potential role as a tool in ecosystem management.
I'm Tanya Rogers. I'm a research fish biologist here at NOAA Fisheries. My background is in ecology, and I got more interested in population dynamics and modeling in graduate school and in how that can be applied to solving ecological problems. Steve was my postdoctoral advisor, and we continue to collaborate on projects.
Co-wrote several papers on chaos and empirical dynamical modeling in biology and especially in conservation and wildlife management.
Primarily fisheries, but the math is the same whether it's a bird or a fish.
My recollection from college was fisheries was the place one made money with population biology.
Yeah,
Well, I think fisheries certainly makes itself a lot of money, and there's a lot of interest in ensuring that fisheries are sustainable and profitable. And so there's a lot of interest in making sure that our management is as good as it can be and that we're using the best models possible for fisheries.
my PhD advisor once said that a lot of people in the oceanography program look down on fisheries, but fisheries employs more marine ecologists than any other subdiscipline. So it's not a bad bet if you would like to have a job after grad school.
And you're applying chaos theory right now to fisheries management, right?
Applying it right now to fisheries data in the hopes of getting this stuff used in management. There's the fishery for shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a federally managed fishery where they're exploring using EDM to set harvest policy and next year's landings targets. And
Could
in
you explain EDM before we go further?
Empirical dynamic modeling, or EDM, is a way of modeling a dynamical system when we have incomplete knowledge and incomplete data about that system, as is often the case in ecosystems. And it does so in a way that preserves the dynamical properties of that system, including chaos, and allows us to make better short-term predictions in chaotic systems without making a lot of assumptions. So EDM has two main features. The first is that it's a non-parametric approach that makes few assumptions about the functional forms of relationships. And the second is that it uses time lags to account for unobserved variables. To explain this further, the relationship between some value, say fish abundance, and its past values is going to follow the relationship in the data rather than some predefined functional form. It can also happen that some of the apparent noise around this relationship can be explained by adding additional dimensions. For example, the abundance of a prey species. So perhaps we can predict fish abundance better using past fish abundance and past prey abundance. Now, it may be the case that we don't have data on prey abundance, in which case you can actually substitute an additional lag of fish abundance. So not just fish last year, but also fish 2 years ago. And you'll get a different looking relationship, but it will still do a pretty good job at predicting abundance. So why this works has to do with Taken's delay embedding theorem, but the point is that missing variables create memory in the system, and so you can use lags of observed variables as substitutes for unobserved variables. What this means practically in population biology is that we can model population size as some function of lags of past population sizes, and this function is fit using non-parametric methods. What this means practically in population biology is that we're modeling population size as some function of lags of past population sizes, and this function is fit using non-parametric methods. So chaos and using methods that can accommodate chaos like EDM matters for ecological forecasting because it affects how far realistically you can predict into the future. So chaotic dynamics, unlike random dynamics, are deterministic and predictable in the short term. And so if chaos is mischaracterized as noise around an equilibrium, you're going to miss out on that short-term predictability and make worse forecasts than you could otherwise. Long-term forecasts will also be inaccurate and overconfident if you assume the system is just going to converge to an equilibrium. In terms of ecological inference, the sensitivity to initial conditions that results from chaos might also help explain why some experimental replicates with seemingly identical starting conditions sometimes end up in totally different places.
How do you determine sensitivity to initial conditions, or whether it's just random?
Well, it's part of it is determining whether or not it's chaotic or not. There are a variety of methods for detecting chaos, which we explore in our paper. Many of them use EDM or a similar form of time delay embedding to reconstruct the dynamics in a flexible way. And from that, estimate some quantities such as the Lyapunov exponent, which quantifies the deterministic divergence rate of nearby trajectories.
The idea is actually really simple, that if you take 2 points, 2 states of the system that are initially close together, in day-to-day experience, the things that we think of as predictable, as deterministic, you do the same thing twice in a row, you expect to get the same answer. You do slightly different things twice in a row, you expect to get slightly different answers, right? And that's where chaos is really different. You do slightly different things and you get really different answers, if you wait long. That's the important part. That's the difference between something that's random and something that's chaotic. Something's random, you do two slightly different things. You get two different answers immediately. Whereas in chaos, things become effectively random if you wait long enough. But there's the period between then and now where you can see the dynamics unfolding, and that makes things predictable, at least over the short term.
So that paper, we explored several different methods that are used to detect chaos. Many of them were developed in physics, but had not been tested on ecologically or time series of ecologically relevant lengths, which is to say short ones, and with ecologically relevant levels of observation error.
So to give you some context for that, a lot of those papers test things on short time series, which have 5,000 observations. Ecological time series that are long are 50 years, which is one time point.
That would be an astonishing data set.
Right.
50 years.
Yeah. So what, 2 people's careers is 50 years, right, of ecological data collection. So very different standards in terms of, time series length. So it was an open question whether any of these things would work on ecologically relevant timescales. And there are definitely things that we would miss, having only 50 time points that you would love to see if you had 5,000. But
we found 3 of the 6 methods we tried did not work very well at all, but 3 performed reasonably well. And in the presence of observation error, they were more likely to not detect chaos when it's present than to detect chaos when it's absent.
This is one of the things that attracted me to chaos initially, was that techniques developed in one field could be applied to a seemingly completely unrelated field. So I would love if you could get into details on how you chose what to port over from physics and what you had to change.
So I think whether we're talking about complex physical systems or complex ecological systems, the concepts are very much the same. And so the main difference, I think, are in terms of data availability, observation error, the timescales over which the dynamics occur, and also how well we understand the underlying dynamics.
The biggest hurdle to having chaos come over to biology is all of the mathematical jargon.
So what you guys discovered is maybe there's many more chaotic, not random ecosystems or species than we thought. And this has implications for managing the population in the short run.
In our study, we found that chaos wasn't rare in a database of ecological population time series. It wasn't the majority of time series, but chaos wasn't rare enough to be ignorable, particularly for short-lived species.
So Since chaos theory reached its heyday in the late 90s, early 2000s, people have arrived at the conclusion that chaos is rare in ecology, and rare is hardly ever defined quantitatively, right? People frequently say, well, chaos is rare, therefore are safe in assuming equilibrium. Chaos is rare, therefore we are safe in using linear models to approximate dynamics.
Am I correct that that doesn't make sense regardless of chaos? You can
Yeah.
have non-chaotic, nonlinear dynamics.
Right, there is that, but most of the time, the context is like to imagine that ecological systems are stable, and given that they are stable, they will recover from some small perturbation,
That
go
there's some
on being what they
equilibrium
are.
point that
Yeah,
is definitely self-reinforcing and maybe an attractor.
yeah, um, and and so a lot of the time the math comes after you assume stability. Stability is the foundation from which we're going. Then you can approximate things with the linear dynamics reasonably well. You can have some hope of assuming an equilibrium and not being terribly wrong. But if things are chaotic and not stable, then that's not true.
So if you have a fish population that you are trying to manage to get maximum yield from, if you think there's some equilibrium, what you try to do is not disturb things away from the equilibrium too much. But what happens if it's chaotic
So I
management of an
think probably
equilibrium?
in terms of management, the biggest change in perspective is that a state dependent policy can do a lot better than one that is just sort of do the same thing all the time. If you imagine that things are equilibrium and stable, then you can set a harvest policy and let it go. And sometimes you'll be over, sometimes you'll be under, but all in all, it'll come out in the wash and you'll end up with more or less the average return will be what you predict for the steady state. If things are chaotic, when you're over or under, you'll just keep going off in some direction that you hadn't really been expecting. And so a better policy would be one where you say, okay, when we're in this state, you can harvest this much. When the fish abundance is low or has been low for several years, you need to change to a different harvest strategy. When things have been high for several years, you need to change to a different strategy. And you can do a lot better than by trying to stick with exactly the same thing.
Is anyone doing that?
That is what we're trying to do with the shrimp fishery in the Gulf of Mexico, what we're trying to do with the squid fishery in California. Importantly, both of these are short-lived species that have huge fluctuations in abundance. That the typical mental model is that dynamics are being driven by unpredictable environmental variation. In contrast to long-lived species, like things like on this coast, like the rockfish, which live typically for decades and their dynamics are much smoother. And so a lot of the sort of standard fisheries things work out okay because the dynamics are so slow to change. But in these short-lived species, the dynamics are much faster and they fluctuate much more dramatically, which is why I think that there's a reason to try applying EDM or chaos theory to managing them. And it turns out that in these species that we typically say, oh, well, most of that fluctuation is due to environmental variation. It turns out that we actually have reasonably good predictability, 2 or 3 times the predictability that we have with our standard steady state models.
Oh, so there was a rapid change that was put down to change in the environment, and you can predict that it would have happened using a deterministic model.
Yes, this is where we're using the empirical dynamic modeling stuff, where the idea is you use past values of the abundance or whatever the system variable is. But in this case, it's the past abundances of shrimp or squid to tell us where the next abundance is likely to go. Now, it's not just this year's.
Tanya, are you working on that too?
Yeah, so I've been helping support the applications that Steve is discussing, exploring how we can use EDM to improve predictability in managed species, and also when, where, and in which species we expect to see chaos in ecology more broadly. So the idea is if we use if using time lags of our observed variables as additional coordinates gets us better predictions, that tells us there are state variables missing, and we could potentially do better if we had additional data on those variables, if we can figure out what they are.
So the idea is like, if you have a 50 variable system, if you could fill in every variable, then that would be enough. You could just use your model to predict the next state. But if you have 5 of those variables, if you use just those 5, predictions are bad. But if you track those 5 variables through the past, that gives you some insight into the missing 45.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a mathematical subtlety there, and I don't know if this is of interest. But if you start with a system that's 50 variables, most of the time in things that have chaos, they are contracting. The dynamics actually don't fill that 50-dimensional space. They're actually constrained to often a much lower dimensional shape called the attractor for the system. And it's the dimension of that tells you how many lags you need or how far into the past you need to go to reconstruct the dynamics. So
if the attractor has 5 dimensions, you need to go 5 steps into the past?
That's twice the attractor dimension plus 1. So
okay.
11.
Interesting. Is it possible to figure out the dimensions of the state of the attractor? How do you do that in practice?
So typically there are a variety.
The simplest way to go about that is to forecast with 1, then 2, and then 3 dimensions, and then continue until you get to a point where the prediction accuracy saturates.
So you're applying EDM to fisheries in particular. You've got the shrimp, you've got the squid. When will you know if it's working? How will you know if it's working?
Well, there's working and there's working, right? I mean, so in terms of being able to make better predictions than we can with the models we've been using so far, that is working now.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of knowing whether our revised harvest policy is going to work better than our historical harvesting policy, that's going to take some time. You can really only get there by doing it. And so it's actually kind of hard. It's a hard sell, right? To move to a whole new branch of doing things in real life when you can't really demonstrate that you're sure that it's going to work.
I'm going to ask you both to speculate wildly. Assuming you waved a magic wand and some fishery management of your choice started using your system, what would the improvement be?
Well, I have no idea about that, but I will say that when we've simulated things, we typically do somewhere between 10 to 50% better harvest, depending on how the system really works.
When you say better, you mean more accurate?
I mean, in terms of 10 to 50% more in terms of sustainable. We almost always do somewhere between 20 to 50% better in terms of prediction accuracy.
That sounds really impressive.
So the idea is that if populations are fluctuating a lot, we can predict those fluctuations and then harvest accordingly. So this way, fishers aren't overharvesting when abundances are low and won't miss out on fish they could harvest sustainably when abundances are high. So for instance, I work a bit on salmon forecasting, and there's a lot of interest in making accurate predictions of salmon runs or salmon returns, so they can determine how much people can safely harvest versus allow to return to the spawning grounds to start the next generation. For my work, at least, I developed a new forecast model for the Sacramento River winter run Chinook salmon, which is an endangered run. Managers here want to know how many of these fish are going to be returning in order to set harvest rates so that the endangered run isn't overly impacted by ocean fishing on non-endangered runs, since Chinook salmon are hard to tell apart when they're out in the ocean. And this is one where the time series are a little too short to do EDM with time lags. There's only about 20 years of data, but we've been able to use non-parametric regressions and other ways to try and get better forecasts. And that model is currently in use for management, and it appears to be doing a much better job than the population model they'd been using previously.
So you did make substantial improvements in harvest.
Well, we made improvements, at least in prediction. Salmon in California face a lot of challenges, not just fishing. And the fishery right now in California is closed due to low abundances of all stocks. So we'll have to wait and see. Recently, the Salmon Prize forecasting competition started. It's something I participated in on the side for fun outside of work. And they've been looking for people to develop models and submit forecasts for different salmon runs. This year's was for sockeye in 3 different systems, with the hope of finding better prediction models than the ones that are currently in use.
Cool. Going back to some of the earlier work we were discussing, Steve, you mentioned you were bringing over a lot of stuff from physics, but it needed to be adapted. One of the reasons I got interested in chaos in particular was it seemed like it should give you the ability to do work in one field and port it to 5 different fields. I'm really curious for every step of this, starting with how did you find the tools you ended up porting over?
So the main tool is the empirical dynamic modeling stuff, which had its origins in the sort of physics literature in the
so EDM came over from physics itself.
So
do you know how it
Takens-
made that leap?
Yeah, so there are a couple of seminal papers in the late 80s, early 90s. So Sugihara and May in 1990 showed that you could do this nonlinear forecasting stuff and in an ecological setting, and that you could make predictions of ecological dynamics without having to have a specific model formulation. A little bit prior to that, Bill Schaefer and Mark Cott had a paper on using sort of time delays to try and reconstruct a low dimensional projection of the dynamics. So their idea was very similar in spirit, using this sort of time lags to reconstruct things, but it didn't quite take off as a tool for making practical forecasts. So that's what Sugihara and May managed to do. But the idea of the time delays in lieu of a complete set of state variables comes from initially a paper by Packard et al., and then a rigorous proof of that idea. So that's in 1980, and then a rigorous proof of the idea in 1981 by Takens.
There were specific scientists who found it somehow.
Yeah.
I am very curious about the step before the papers get written. What drove people to find something either outside their field, or why was someone already working in an interdisciplinary way and porting over these tools?
So the really early, right, like in the 70s, Bob May, John Beddington, Bill Schaefer, they were all working on chaos in ecological dynamics as like from a theoretical point of view. And they were showing that like with really low dimensional models, you could get nearly effectively random looking dynamics. And maybe that's why ecological dynamics looks as messy as it does. But there wasn't any easy way to connect that to ecological time series. There were a couple of attempts to do that by fitting low dimensional models to some time series data. Those generally concluded that things were not chaotic. Bob May actually has a really super quote in one of those papers that says, fitting what is likely to be the high dimensional dynamics of the ecological system to this low dimensional model does great violence to the reality of ecology. That didn't work. It was a reasonable thing to try when you don't have too much data, but that idea just doesn't really work. And then the time delay embedding stuff got invented. And those guys were busy they were part of the chaos community. It wasn't like, Bob May just sort of saw that and said, oh yeah, I can grab that and bring it over from without any initial sort of prep. He was already sort of actively participating in the sort of theoretical chaos stuff. So
when was he doing that?
So his early stuff on chaos and ecological dynamics happens in the early 1970s. And so when a Takens delay embedding theorem happens, it does take a little while for people to pick it up and turn it into a practically useful tool, the ecologists and the physicists are so completely separate that it's a miracle that it makes it over.
There are people who are already straddling the borders.
Yeah.
That's hard to do in academia, isn't it?
Well, Bob May started in physics and came over to ecology from physics. So, and there have been a lot of people who've gone that way. He's arguably the most successful physicist turned ecologist by a lot, but there are surprisingly few people who go the other way.
Yeah, I do notice physics seems to send out a lot more immigrants.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the physics job market is just really tight.
Yeah, I was just reading Doyne Farmer's book on chaos and finance. And what he says is, well, there weren't any more physics jobs, but they would pay us so much money to do finance.
Yep. Those were good times. One of the sort of really interesting things about sort of theoretical ecology and then applied theoretical ecology and then like real, like boots on the ground ecology is the level of math involved is like an order of magnitude between each one. Right. So the theoreticians are real mathematicians. And then the folks who do sort of quantitative fisheries management are, jack of all trades. They know just enough math to do one thing, just enough math to do another thing, trying to put it all together with some statistics. And then there are the people who collect data, and those people often know very little math. If there was a physics-like revolution in theoretical ecology, I'm not sure as one of the sort of mid-level guys. I'd be aware of it.
Interesting. In weather, which is so incredibly complicated, the big breakthrough was ensemble forecasting, that you make a bunch of different forecasts, jiggling your assumptions a little bit. And that's how you get 30% chance of rain, because 30% of nearby worlds produced rain. Has ensemble forecasting been tried in ecology or in wildlife management?
I've definitely run across papers where people have talked about ensemble forecasts for ecological dynamics or even super ensemble forecasts. But I'm not aware that it's made an enormous difference in terms of the predictions. I think maybe the biggest reason for that is that there are too many people that I'm aware of who argue that the Navier-Stokes equations, the things that govern the fluid dynamics that governs the weather, right, are wrong, right? We all kind of accept that the Navier-Stokes equations are the equations of fluid dynamics. And so the real uncertainties are in how you handle the boundaries. How do you model the mountains? How do you model the clouds? Those are the parts where we're not certain. And so if we vary those and we average over some amount of uncertainty in those boundary conditions and the initial conditions, we can sort of take care of some of that and sort of push a little farther into the future in terms of how far we can make reasonable predictions. In ecology, on the other hand, there aren't the equivalent of the Navier-Stokes equations. There isn't some like first principles model of how an ecosystem works that's sufficient to make the kinds of predictions you might want to manage.
That's why you end up with something like EDM, where you don't need to know what you don't know.
There are two pillars to EDM. The first is what we talked about, that you can accommodate the fact that you have incomplete observations. That is, you haven't seen all of the state variables of the system using lags of the observables. That's one pillar. The second pillar of EDM is that we're not going to try and write down equations for how that collection of variables turns into the future states of those variables. We're instead going to try and infer that directly from what we've seen in the past. And so this sort of combination of using lags as surrogate variables and using sort of non-parametric or super flexible data-driven approaches to modeling, to turning the past states of the system into the future. That's the second part that's really important.
Okay, thank you. What got you interested in that in grad school?
I guess it was meeting Steve. And I came to do an internship here at NOAA when I was in graduate school for a few months. I started working with Steve and discovered that he invented and created new methods for analyzing data, which I did not realize was a thing as a just user of existing methods. And I thought that was really cool. And that Steve has a really cool way of just thinking about ecosystems and how species interact from a mathematical perspective that I think brings a lot of insight. And he made population dynamics interesting. I previously did a lot of community ecology work, collected a lot of data myself, was mostly counting things. I did experiments in the labs, and this was just kind of a different approach that I thought was valuable. And I've, as part of my work, and that's why I think I got this job at NOAA, is that I can kind of merge the like mathematical approaches and field approaches and
so this is like
natural
the
history.
central tier that Steve was talking about, is you have some people who are doing, my dad's an applied mathematician, so he would call them recreational mathematicians. And you have the boots on the ground people, and then you've got the sort of interfacers.
Yeah, that's us.
So Steve's a very good interfacer. I definitely started as like a boots on the ground. I still do some of that data collection work myself. And I think that brings a valuable perspective in terms of understanding the complexity of ecosystems and where the data come from and sources of error. And even just like the natural history of some of these systems and what would make sense in terms of modeling them. I try and bring that perspective to my job as like fisheries ecologist and someone who helps with forecasting and management and stock assessments. And then in terms of research, I continue to collaborate with Steve on a bunch of different projects related to chaos and population dynamics and predictability in ecology.
And Tanya provides an irreplaceable anchor to reality. Like I will go off and find some like cool thing and some statistical mechanics, and I'll be like, "Oh, what do you think about this?" She's like, "Why? How will we use that, Steve? Like, what is that for?" And that sort of sounding board for like, what is the practical value of this thing? How are we going to do it? Is it going to work on the data that we have available? Is just incredible. Plus, I think Tanya's selling herself a bit short. She's also incredibly talented as a scientist and is great at getting things done, and a great writer.
You guys found each other more or less at random?
Yeah.
Like this wasn't a purposeful pairing.
Actually, it's a guy named Brian Wells who Tanya was actually here to work with. He said, "Oh, you might get something out of talking to Steve," and so he introduced us. And then I found out that Tanya had data that was actually really great for applying a method that I'd cooked up, and after that we really hit it off. So.
Yes, that was my third dissertation chapter, and then Steve offered me a postdoc, and I came out and worked with them a bit, and then I got the job that I currently have at NOAA in the same office, working for a different group, but we continue working together.
That's all I had. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks. You too. Bye.